Vincent Scarfo is the coordinator of the Mark David LGBTQ Center, and I'm really excited to hear his workshop discussion, because this is an area that we as future healthcare professionals need to be competent in so that we can give all of our patients high quality care. But with that, I'm going to mute myself for now and let Vincent take over. Thank you.
Alrighty, can y'all hear me? I'm using a microphone set up over here, so hopefully it's picking up my voice well enough. Alrighty. I'm just going to share my screen here so we can get this started. Here we go. Alrighty, so this is LGBTQ 101 for healthcare providers. It's not too different from like my usual LGBT 101 presentation, except I go a little bit further into trans and intersex issues, because that's what a lot of healthcare workers will be experiencing that they probably don't have a lot of experience with. So to get us all started off, let's just jump into vocabulary. Oh, and like Laura said earlier, my name is Vincent Scarfo. I am the coordinator for the Mark David LGBTQ Center on CCP's campus, and I'm available remotely. So if you'd like to email me, I will put my email in the chat afterwards. Um, so let's talk about, what does LGBTQ stand for? So LGBTQ is actually an acronym that is a lot longer than just LGBTQ. I've actually seen it out as like LGBTQQIA, LGBTQQIAHP. Like there's a lot of different acronyms that you could use because it really stands for a bunch of different things. So I'm just going to go through what these letters really mean and what encompasses the community. So we have lesbian, and that's a woman who is attracted to women. We have gay, which is a man who is attracted to men. We have bisexual, which is someone who is attracted to people who are the same gender as them and a different gender than themselves. We have transgender, who's someone whose gender does not match the gender they were assigned at birth. We have queer, which is someone, it's kind of an umbrella term, but people who kind of don't really fit into any of the other categories may use queer because it's a less specific term. So it can be used as a more kind of broad term or a less defined term for someone who doesn't really want to define their sexuality, but it can also be used as a umbrella term. There's also a history of this use as a slur. So a lot of older members of the community are not a big fan of the word. So I would say LGBTQ is a great way to use to refer to the community unless you're part of the community, or unless specifically someone from that group has identified it as the queer community. And also, you should not use queer unless a specific person identifies that way. So that would be, if someone identifies as queer, it's a good idea to use queer as their identity. But because of its history as a slur, it's not always great to use that when you're unsure how someone identifies. Next, we have intersex. So intersex is someone who their physical attributes go into both of the most common binary biological sexes. So if you look at them biologically, you can't neatly put them into male or female categories. You should not use the word hermaphrodite. That is a dated term. Intersex is an appropriate and current term for people who have, some people say, like ambiguous genitalia. Someone who has, so someone may have a penis and ovaries, or testes and a vulva. So there's intersex people do not fall into the two most common categories of male and female. Asexual is someone who does not experience sexual desire, or someone who does not get enjoyment from sexual activity. Pansexual is someone, it's similar to bisexual. It's someone who is attracted to people of any gender, or for someone who's for who gender is not an important factor in their attraction. Demisexual is someone who needs to feel like an emotional attraction or some sort of vibe with someone before they can feel a physical attraction towards them. Non-binary is someone who does not identify as male or female, or as a man or as a woman. So they're somewhere outside of that binary way of thinking about gender. Genderqueer is similar to non-binary, but it's also similar to the word queer, where it has kind of more of an umbrella term, or a more kind of, I guess, a less specific terminology. So if you aren't really sure how to identify yourself, or you really aren't sure how to describe your gender, genderqueer is a good example of that. A good phrase that people use for that, instead of like just kind of being like, oh, it's hard to describe, they just say, oh, I'm genderqueer. It's a very broad term, but it also provides the freedom to identify under a label that people somewhat understand. Gender fluid is kind of a more amorphous thing. It's people whose gender kind of changes from day to day, so that they may feel more masculine on one day, more feminine on another day. They may want to use they, them pronouns one day, she, her pronouns a different day. So the fluidity refers to kind of a changing state. So it's not a fixed gender, fixed state. Gray A is on the asexual, demisexual spectrum. So a lot of people feel that asexual, gray A, and demisexual are kind of this spectrum of people who don't always enjoy sex or sexual activity, and kind of their enjoyment or their desire for those things is on this kind of spectrum. So gray A are people who are mostly asexual or partially asexual, but don't want to identify as fully asexual. Questioning is anyone who's kind of exploring their gender identity or their sexuality and trying to understand how they identify themselves. So it's kind of a temporary state. Some people spend years kind of questioning their gender or their sexuality. Others spend a brief period of time in that questioning phase, but we don't want to exclude people who are questioning their identity from the community. So we include them in this kind of alphabet soup. And then these last three are groups that are not, if you are part of all three of these, you are not part of the community, but there are people within the community who have these identities. So that is cisgender, straight, and allosexual. And so cisgender means that you are not trans, which means that the gender you are assigned at birth matches your gender identity. Straight is someone who is attracted to, it's like a man who's attracted to women or a woman who's attracted to men exclusively. And then allosexual is someone who does experience sexual attraction. So a gay man may be cisgender and allosexual, but they're not straight, so they are part of the community. But if you have someone who is cisgender, straight, and allosexual, they are not part of the community. So I include them here because we don't want to use words like normal or usual, or like create some sort of value judgment on being straight or being cisgender or being allosexual, because it's perfectly normal to be part of the LGBT community. But when you only label people who are part of a marginalized group and don't apply a label to the majority group, then you basically create this othering language. So I want to make sure we include those words as well. Actually, let's pause here for questions. Anybody have questions on these? I know some people came in late. Were there any terms that you all do not know already that you want me to go over again? Okay, great. So a lot of times when we talk about gender and sexuality, we talk about them kind of lumped together, but they are two distinct things. So you have trans people who may identify as straight. It's not inherent that if you are transgender that you will be part of the like LGBT minority sexualities. You can, it's a separate thing altogether. So when we talk about gender identity and we talk about sexual orientation, those are two separate things. And so this is a model that we used to use, and it kind of looks at everything on these single axis spectrums. And a lot of people found this to be pretty limiting. So if you are attracted to both men and women, this bottom kind of graph wouldn't really be helpful to you, because it's like, you don't really feel like you're in the middle. You are very attracted to women and you're very attracted to men. So you may be 100% bisexual. So like, why are you in the middle of this spectrum? So the next model that kind of came out and came into more preferred use is this gender unicorn model, that instead of looking at it on a single axis, it looks at it on separate axes and does like this kind of vector model. So it allows you to kind of place a point on each of these vectors to express your own personal identity. So you could hand this out to a group of people and ask them to kind of circle where they fall in this. And so someone may circle that they are very attracted to women, but not very attracted to men. So they kind of fall different spaces on these. So I think this I really like, but it also separates gender and sexuality in a way that I think is really easy to understand. So on the top here, you have your gender, which is your gender split into gender identity and gender expression. So your gender expression is how you express your identity, the clothes you wear, the way you style your hair, the makeup you wear, how you present yourself to the world. And then your gender identity is like how you identify, regardless of how you present. So someone who is a trans woman who hasn't come out of the closet yet may wear more masculine clothing. So their gender expression is masculine, but their gender identity is as a woman. So we separate those things because they are two different things. The way that you present yourself to the world is not always going to match who you are on the inside. So it creates a little bit of a difference there. But there's also non-binary people who dress very feminine or very masculine. And we don't want to like limit those people to like, there's only one way to be non-binary. And then at the bottom, we have separated sexual attraction into physical attraction and emotional attraction. And this is kind of where asexual people come in. So for asexual people may put physical attraction at 0 for all those vectors and emotional attraction at like 100 for all of those. So it allows for a lot more flexibility in kind of describing your own sexuality and gender. And then in the middle here, we have sex assigned at birth. And so the reason we do that is because biological sex and gender are not the same thing. And biological sex has been largely put into two main categories of male and female. And then folks who do not fit into that binary are labeled as intersex. So rather than having vectors for biological sex and sex assigned at birth, we just have these 3 distinct points. And that's actually one of the main things that we're going to talk today, because that's what a lot of medical professionals will run into when working with trans students. Let me just see, we got a chat coming in, so I'm just going to check what that is. I think that's an attendance thing. All right, so any questions about the gender unicorn before we move on to our next slide? Great, so let's hop into the next slide, which is specifically about intersex people. So we talked a little bit about how a doctor assigns kind of a biological sex or gender at birth, and usually it has to do with the infant's genitals. So what we see is the determination of people with more ambiguous genitalia are either kind of put into male, female, or intersex categories based on the length of the genitalia. And a lot of times, doctors will do unnecessary cosmetic surgery to remove the penis so that they are a woman with a vagina, or they will do surgery to usually the most common thing is that they'll remove a perfectly functioning penis and kind of cosmetically turn it into a clitoris to avoid having intersex people. And a lot of intersex activists are saying that this medical practice needs to stop, because you're basically doing an unnecessary cosmetic surgery on perfectly healthy body parts on an infant who is too young to consent. And so a lot of people are actually advocating for hospitals to stop performing surgeries on infants, especially because a lot of intersex children have perfectly functioning genitalia. There's no reason to surgically alter it. It's literally just kind of forcing people into a binary that isn't really that binary, which we'll get to a little bit in the next slide. Oh, and some other important things to talk about with intersex people. Intersex people make up 1% of the population. They're about as common as people who have red hair. So it's not really a small population. Like 1% sounds like a little, but that's over 7 million people. So it's quite a significant portion of the population. And so to act like um, that biological sex or gender is completely binary is a very dated way of looking at things. It has been disproven by science in many different ways. And a lot of people who are holding on to that are holding on to science that came from a lot of social and cultural influence that is not necessarily good science. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between biological sex and gender. So when we talk about biological sex, we're actually talking about a bunch of different factors, and not all of them are necessarily used by doctors when determining an infant's gender at birth, or biological sex at birth. So when we talk about biological sex, we're talking about a few things. We're talking about chromosomes. So a lot of people think of XX is woman, XY is man, but in reality, there's a bunch of different variations that we have. So a lot of them are mutations, but there's also folks who just kind of don't fall into these two neat categories. So you have people with XX chromosomes, XXX chromosomes, XXY chromosomes, XY chromosomes, a single X chromosome. So there's a bunch of different variations that you can have there. And then in addition to chromosome, there's other genes that we typically see in male patients versus female patients. But there's people who they may be male, but some of their genetics are more typically found in females. So it's not necessarily like all females are this way and all males are this way. There's some variation within all of these categories that you can't neatly put them into two piles. Hormones, a lot of people think of testosterone as the male hormone and estrogen as the female hormone, but in reality, all humans have different levels of estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone. Some males have low testosterone, some females have high testosterone, some males have high estrogen, some females have low estrogen. It really just depends. And so to say that all males have high testosterone and all females have high estrogen is not quite a true statement. It's definitely a generalization that has been kind of made into a factual statement, but is not necessarily backed by science. Then you have internal sex organs. So this would be ovaries, testes, uterus. And then you have external sex organs, which is like your penis, vagina, vulva. And so a lot of times with intersex infants, we'll see people who have internal and external sex organs that don't match the same binary biological sex. So you may have an infant with a penis, but instead of testes, they have ovaries. A lot of times people don't find this out until they're adults because we don't actually look at internal sex organs with an ultrasound of all babies that are born. And so the reason that external sex organs is highlighted in green is because that is the main way that doctors determine an infant's biological sex. And so there's times where later in life, they'll do a genetic test, or they'll do a hormone test, or they'll do like an ultrasound to see internal sex organs and realize that this person is intersex because they didn't actually look at these things. And then you have secondary sex characteristics. So a lot of this is a little bit tied to hormones. So based on hormone levels, different secondary sex characteristics will develop. So breast tissue, broad shoulders, like the shape of your face and your facial features, facial hair, all those things are determined. But all of those things are usually categorized as male or female secondary sex characteristics. And the reason that this one is highlighted in green is this is often how strangers will gender people without knowing their gender, which is not necessarily the greatest thing, which we'll get into a little bit later when we talk about gender. And then the last thing I want to talk about is brain structure. So there's actually been studies that show that males and females have different brain structures. And there's a part of the brain that is like specifically different in men versus women when studying cis men and cis women. But they did a study that with trans women, with cis men, cis women, and trans women, and they found that trans women, this part of their brain is more similar. It's very similar to cis women and not at all similar to cis men, which proves that trans women's brains are different than men. So that kind of gets rid of the idea that trans women are just men in dresses. And so these are not like fringe studies. These are all studies found in reputable science magazines. So the studies that I pulled from in making this list included Harvard University, Stanford University, Scientific American. These are not like random fringe groups, like they're not trans rights activists or intersex rights activists making up studies. These are actual peer-reviewed studies that have been published in scientific journals. And so when you look at these 7 different characteristics, typically you'll like, if you had a column next to each of them that said like, okay, check here if they have the attributes typically attributed to males, and check here if you have attributes typically attributed to females, you could have those 2 columns and there would be people who have check marks in both columns. And so when you actually kind of graph it out, like say you said every check in the male column is every check in the male column is -1 and every check in the female column is +1, and then you kind of charted it, and everyone in this kind of pink zone is female and everyone in this male zone is male and everyone in this kind of purple zone is intersex. That's kind of how we separate biological sex. It's not a binary, because if it was a binary, you would just have males and females and that's it. And what we actually see is not a binary, but we see a bimodal distribution, which is what you see in this chart here. This is just a generic Wikipedia image of a bimodal distribution. It is not necessarily graphing gender, but this kind of visually gives you an idea of what it would look like. And there's also a lot of studies that still need to get done. Like I mentioned, there was a study specifically with trans women and their brain structure, but there hasn't been a lot of studies with trans men or with non-binary people. So there's a lot more science that could happen to give us more information about the trans community, but that requires funding and it requires researchers who care about the topic and know about the topic. So really it involves a lot of trans people going to medical school and doing some important studies to give us more information. So that's biological sex. And I want you all to notice that when I'm talking about biological sex, I use male and female. And the reason I do that is that male and female are scientific terms about biological sexes. When we're talking about gender, we're saying woman and man. And so whenever you ask, like, so if you're making a form that asks someone's gender, you don't want to put male, female, transgender, man, you don't want to mix gender and biological sex. They are different things, and you don't want to like kind of create this false dichotomy, because when you talk about biological sex, you basically erase trans people. And so it's better to ask questions about someone's gender than their biological sex. And because biological sex makes up all these different things, when you're on a like medical form and you ask a trans person a confusing question about their biology, you're not actually getting the information that you need. Because if you're using that kind of sex or gender line to determine whether someone could possibly be pregnant or what kind of genetic diseases they may have, you're gonna miss a lot of information when you are talking to trans patients. So it's really important to have trans inclusive language on your form so that you make sure you're capturing medically accurate information from your trans patients. So if you need to know if they have a uterus, then you need to ask your patients, do you have a uterus? Instead of asking them if they're male or female. And so I think we've used this question of male versus female as a shorthand to tell us a lot of information, a lot of medical information, but that only really applies to cisgender people and non-intersex people. So you are running the risk of, you're basically making it so that trans people have to do extra work beyond the paperwork that they're doing for their intake to give you information about their body instead of just asking the questions of what you need to know. So if it were up to me, I would always have forms that ask specifically about genitals, internal sex organs, rather than using gender or sex as a shorthand for that. But let's talk a little bit about gender. What is gender? So gender, rather than being a biological sex, is just a social and cultural construct. And so the reason that we have 2 genders is because of British colonialism. So there were many cultures that had more than two genders or didn't really think about gender at all. And then British colonialism was like, up, there's two genders and we're taking our culture everywhere around the world. So we're making it so that everywhere that we colonize is now going to have the same kind of cultural ideas about gender that we do. So you have cultures on the American continents that had a third gender called two-spirit, now are being forced into this binary idea of gender. And then you have folks on the Indian subcontinent, which some cultures had up to 5 genders, who are now being forced into this kind of two-gender model. So a lot of the reason we talk about two genders and gender binaries is because of British colonialism. So maybe I skipped ahead with this one. Before we start this pronouns video, I do want to talk a little bit about non-binary genders. So one of the things with non-binary people is that they do not fall into either binary category of man or woman. And so any sort of form that talks about women's issues or men's issues is automatically probably excluding a lot of trans people, but specifically non-binary trans people who don't fall into either category. And so when we talk about women's health, we are not only ignoring trans men, we are also ignoring non-binary people who have uteruses and vaginas who are impacted by women's health initiatives. So it's better to refer to it as reproductive health. And so a non-binary person, because they don't identify as male or female, may use different pronouns than you're used to. So instead of using he, him pronouns or she, her pronouns, they may use they, them pronouns. And so I wanted to play this video. I think that my video is, oh, here we go. Share computer sound. Okay, so I'm gonna play this video. It should work. If the sound is not working, please let me know.
Hi, I'm Jake Edwards and I am a non-binary YouTuber and musician. Some bright lights. Why are pronouns important? Well, pronouns are a part of the language you use to address a person, and they change depending on who you're talking to, and you should always address someone with respect. Deciding not to use the correct pronouns for a trans person is a huge sign of disrespect, and will most likely lead to that person feeling deeply uncomfortable and possibly even unsafe in your company. Personal pronouns are not, as people popularly believe, just he and she. The singular use of they, them pronouns have been around since the 14th century, and was used as a gender-neutral pronoun. The use of they, them has been gradually increasing since the 1970s as singular personal pronouns, as the need for gender-neutral and inclusive language has progressed. Today, it is widely understood that gender is a spectrum, just like sexuality. We have people who sit at very fixed binary points of male and female, but many people exist in the space around those points. This is called non-binary. Many non-binary people like to use they, them pronouns as they don't implicate a binary gender and make them feel uncomfortable. It's important to remember that you can never be sure of a person's pronouns just by looking at them. Gender is a spectrum, and the way we express and present our gender to the outside world is just as vast as that spectrum. Asking a person what their pronouns are is not rude. It can be a little bit intimidating at first, but once you get into the habit, you can be confident that you won't be incorrectly assuming a person's pronouns based on how they present. This is a positive step forward, as it normalizes the behavior of not making assumptions and not linking a person's clothing to how they identify. Very good. Awesome. Many people argue that they, them pronouns are plural and cannot be used as a person's singular pronouns because it's confusing. Much of the English language is confusing, and it's not uncommon to have words that have multiple meanings. Some people just don't realize how often they use they, them in a singular context already. For example, Jamie is bringing a friend over, but I don't know their name. It's used to refer to a person whose gendered pronoun has not yet been identified. So why not use they, them for one person? If someone you meet has pronouns that are they, them, you should respect that and use them. because the impact of misgendering them can take a huge toll on their mental health, and it's extremely disrespectful. Since the 14th century, pronouns outside of he, she, and they have been brought into our language. These are pronouns like a, li, si, and thon, although most of these aren't in use today. They are a part of what we call neopronouns. It can be hard to learn to conjugate these pronouns, but if you meet a person who uses them, it doesn't hurt to give it your best shot and take direction from them, or even look it up for yourself. It takes a small amount of effort on your behalf, but it will most likely mean the world to a person who uses neopronouns. I feel like my eye is twitching. The landscape of our language is always changing and adapting to suit our needs, just as more labels for sexuality have come around over the years. Gender identities have gone through the same thing. Non-binary is an umbrella term that encompasses many labels. Gender fluid is someone who considers their gender to be fluid rather than fixed on one point. Bigender is someone who identifies as two genders, which could be male, female, or a number of other things. Agender is someone who doesn't have a gender at all, and so on. These identities are vast and unique to each person, and no one really feels their gender in the same way. For many non-binary people, using he or she can make them uncomfortable, but lots of people use multiple pronouns. I personally identify as non-binary, and my pronouns are he or they, and that's because I feel a connection to masculinity, but I often feel very fluid and unconstrained by masculine ideas. The term preferred pronouns only comes into play when a person uses multiple pronouns but has a preference. This preference can change day to day as their gender fluctuates. My preferred pronouns are they, but only because they're not the only pronouns that honor me. A trans person does not have preferred pronouns if they only take one set of pronouns. Saying that someone with one set of pronouns has preferred pronouns implies that they have multiple, and in doing so you risk thinking it's okay to misgender them. So using the correct pronouns is not optional. It's okay to ask, respect how labels and language are evolving, and always be open to learning new things. We all have to start somewhere.
Okay, so I just want to touch upon a few things that were brought up in this video that I think are really important. So one of the first ones is that there's no, like, you should not refer to someone's pronouns as their preferred pronouns unless you know that they use multiple pronouns and have a preference. Using preferred pronouns when someone uses only one set of pronouns makes it seem like their pronouns are an optional thing that they prefer you use, rather than a thing which is their pronouns. It's use someone's pronouns or their correct pronouns. So never use the term preferred pronouns unless someone has given you multiple pronouns and you're asking which one they prefer. It seems like a semantic thing, but it does make a difference because it's minimizing language. When you ask someone who uses one set of pronouns what their preferred pronouns are, it does kind of send a subliminal message that their pronouns are a preference rather than inherently something that is true about them, essentially. The other thing is that singular they has been around for so long. The push for using only he or she as personal pronouns has been a fairly recent thing that's happened within the past 100 or so years. It's not something that is like truly inherent to the English language. And even people who have said that we should never use singular they as a pronoun use it. It's like something that we use all the time, like when someone's gender is unknown. So if I hear the mail slot right now, I can't see the front door, but I can hear the mail slot. So I know that a mail person just dropped off some mail, but I don't know who did it. So if someone said, "Oh, what was that noise?" I would say, "Oh, they just dropped off the mail." I know it's only one person, but I don't know their gender. And so saying it's they dropped off the mail, being the mail person, is grammatically correct and caused no issues. And so people who argue that you cannot grammatically use singular they are just wrong. Singular they existed long before singular you. We used to use thou as a singular way to refer to a person. So like language evolves and changes. And there was an editor of a New York periodical, I cannot remember which one, but basically in her book, she wrote that you should never use singular they, but in the previous chapter, she used singular they. So that I always found interesting. there was something else that I wanted to mention about this video, but I can't remember it. So we're just going to move on to the next slide. All right. So one thing you can do is using correct pronouns. Oh, that was the other thing I wanted to talk about was when we talk about trans people, a lot of times people think of like it's going from one gender to the opposite gender. And so that is still a very binary way of thinking about things. And there are binary trans people who their assigned gender at birth is one thing, and they identify as the opposite binary gender. We refer to those people as binary trans people. So a trans woman or a trans man may be a binary trans person. They went from one binary gender to another, but they didn't really go from one binary gender to another. They were always the gender that they are, and the world kind of had misidentified them. So one thing that I like to do is, I'm sure a lot of people have tried to imagine what it's like to be a trans person. And some people have suggested that you kind of do a mind exercise where you imagine what it would be like to be the opposite binary gender of your current gender. But I actually think that's a terrible mind exercise because it kind of, it teaches you to imagine what it would be like if your gender was different rather than imagining if your body was different. So I actually posit that you should imagine what it's like if your body sent a message to everyone around you to call you by the wrong pronouns, the wrong gender, and imagine what that would feel like while keeping your current gender identity as your gender, because it's not about feeling like you are like born in the wrong body or that you were like inherently the wrong gender. It's more so that people see you and they assign a gender to you that doesn't match how you feel. So everyone around you doesn't see the real you. And so I think that's a much better mind exercise than trying to imagine if you were the opposite binary gender, but rather to imagine how it would be if everyone constantly misgendered you. So if you identify as a man, you're a cis man right now, imagine what it'd be like is if you are a man, you identify the same, you look exactly the same, but everyone around you always referred to you as a woman. Everyone always used she, her pronouns. Everyone had trouble remembering your name because it wasn't a feminine name. And that's kind of what it feels like to be a trans person. And so pronouns are one of those important things because it sends a message that like, I'm going to refer to you the way that you want to be referred to, rather than make assumptions about you based on something you have no control over, which is what your body looks like, what your gender, I want to say gendered characteristics, but characteristics that have been assigned a biological gender, and people affiliate and associate with a specific gender. So one of the most important things you can do is learn how to use correct pronouns. And non-binary people use they, them pronouns or neopronouns often. So one of the biggest things as more people come out as non-binary, more people feel comfortable coming out as non-binary, is practicing how to use neutral language and neutral pronouns. And so some of the things you can do is avoid gendered language in general. So just don't gender people unless they gendered themselves. This is a hard thing to do. Like you do not realize how much of society is gendered and how often we split people by gender, or even how many times we address people based on their gender until people start addressing you incorrectly. So I would definitely suggest removing gendered language from your vocabulary where you can, just to make it a safer place or a more accepting place for trans people. So if you're using gendered language for strangers, this is kind of like an okay, better, best kind of for the next 3 bullet points. So this is something that I definitely don't think that anybody should be looking at others and assigning genders to them. But as a society, I realize that we may not be at that point yet. And so I want to offer some kind of like harm reduction techniques as well. So if you are using gendered language for strangers, it is better if you use context clues based on how they express their gender, on what clothing they're wearing, what makeup they're wearing, that kind of stuff, rather than looking at their physical attributes. So if you see someone with broad shoulders and an Adam's apple, but they have like a long-haired wig and makeup and a flowy dress and heels and are presenting feminine in every possible way, it would be better for you to use she, her pronouns than he, him pronouns. pronouns. Because pretty much everything that that person has decided to wear about themselves, everything that they've chosen to wear that morning, rather than something that's inherently about themselves, is what they're trying to send a message to the world as how they present, essentially. And so there are people who dress feminine who will use they, them pronouns. So this is not a perfect thing. I don't necessarily suggest this is the best way to do things, but it is better than looking past someone who is like looking past their makeup, their hair, everything that's presenting feminine to the world, and seeing their broad shoulders and their Adam's apple and saying that's a man. That's just disrespectful. You're literally looking past everything that this person is presenting about themselves to the world to refer to something they literally can't change about themselves without surgery. The next best thing to do would be to just ask what pronouns they use or ask how they identify. I think it's important to consider where you are and who's around. So a lot of times in predominantly straight spaces, it may not necessarily be a comfortable place to ask about pronouns because you may be, I don't know, singling someone out, making it feel like you're asking them because they look more ambiguous. It may create a situation where people feel unsafe because there are folks who sometimes react violently to trans people, unfortunately. But that's just kind of a political and social reality of living in 2020. So I think the best way to do it is really just to introduce yourself with your own pronouns. I think we need to normalize cisgender people using pronouns because everyone has pronouns. Everyone has pronouns that they use for themselves. Cisgender people just happen to match their pronouns that they use are the ones that society often puts upon them. So that's just a nice coincidence for them. But the reason I like this approach the best is because when you introduce yourself and include your pronouns, the person who's responding now has the opportunity to do the same or the opportunity to not. So if you are talking to a non-binary trans person who doesn't really feel safe coming out as non-binary in the mixed company that you are with, they may just say, oh, hi, my name is Vincent, and just not include their pronouns because they don't want to get into the conversation, but you're leaving that power in their hands. So I always think it's best to introduce yourself with your own pronouns, to put your pronouns on your name tag, in your email signature, wherever you can. The more people who use pronouns, the less weird it is when people see pronouns. And it creates an opportunity to talk about pronouns. So like if you say, hi, I'm Vincent, I use they, them pronouns when you're introducing, you're not only giving an opening for that person to share their pronouns, but you're also, if someone doesn't know what you mean by pronouns or is not familiar with trans identities, it opens an opportunity for you to have a conversation with that person about what it means, so that you can become an educator in that moment. So if you're unsure about someone's pronouns, just ask them politely and discreetly. Like I mentioned before, you don't necessarily want to put them on the spot in a group of people. But if you are getting to know someone and you're noticing that you may be using the wrong pronouns or that they may cringe every time you use the right pronoun, the wrong pronouns for them, it's always okay to just kind of say, hey, what pronouns do you use? It's as simple as that. What pronouns do you use? What are your pronouns? Or am I using your pronouns correctly? Am I using your correct pronouns? Are just simple ways to ask. Again, I suggest that's more of a one-on-one conversation. You don't want to necessarily out this person to an entire group of people or single them out. You don't want to only ask this question to people who are dressed more ambiguously or dressed where their kind of gender expression doesn't match their gender assigned at birth. You don't want people to feel like they're being singled out. So I think it's definitely best to kind of make it a practice to ask more people about this than just singling out specifically trans people or people who appear they may be trans. And then here's an important one. Always use correct pronouns even inside your head. I think this is an easy thing for people to mess up on. And I think the biggest contribution to people messing up names and pronouns is that they're not referring to that person by those name and pronouns all the time. And so if you know a trans woman named Sally, always refer to her as Sally and always use she, her pronouns, even when you're talking about her pre-transition. You never want to use someone's former name. We call that a dead name in the trans community. You don't want to use someone's dead name, and you don't want to use someone's incorrect pronouns, even when talking about them in the past. So like when we're talking about Caitlyn Jenner, we never want to use Caitlyn's old name, and we always want to use she, her pronouns, even when talking about when she was, what was she, a track and field star? I don't even remember. She's on the Wheaties box, like, but still, I'm referring to her using she, her pronouns at all times, because even back then, she was a woman. She just hadn't come out with it. She hadn't come out publicly. She hadn't found the words to describe her gender. She was kind of living in the closet, but she was still a woman at the time. And so it's important to use it. Plus, if you think of a trans person and go, well, this is my friend Justin, and he is now a woman, and she goes by Susan, you now have two names and two sets of pronouns associated with this person in your brain. And the one you're going to first is the one you shouldn't use. So your brain is literally going, my friend Justin, he is a woman. She now uses the name Susan. You now have all these extra steps in your brain. And so the first thing your brain thinks is he, him, and Justin, instead of thinking she, her, and Susan. So I have so many friends who I know their dead names, but like I have to think really hard about what it was because I never use it. I don't even think about it. And so like I saw it on a piece of paper once, or I've known them for years and it's what they used to use. And like, it's just kind of like, you don't remember it when you don't use it. So always use the correct name, always use the correct pronouns, even in your head, even when you're talking to other people. It'll make mistakes less likely. It'll make it easier. And I think this is really important for healthcare workers because the name on someone's chart may not match the name that they use, because getting your name legally changed is difficult. So it's really important to learn your patients' names and get to know your patients and not just rely on the chart. And if you are able to change how charts look, advocate for including a chosen name or a preferred name or a nickname field on your chart so that you can make sure that trans people are being called by the correct name. So let's talk a little bit more about gendered language. Something we hear often, please tell him or her to call me. Just say, please tell them to call me. Like he/she, him or her, all these things where we like just kind of create this unnecessary binary are actually wordier and more complicated than just using gender neutral language. When a lawyer meets with his clients, in this case, this lawyer is hypothetical. And so using he or him or his to refer to this unknown hypothetical lawyer is kind of assuming that this lawyer is male, which is not only transphobic, it is also sexist, because you are implying that most lawyers or all lawyers are men and playing into the sexist idea that men are suited for specific professions. And it's just not even necessary. Like you could say when a lawyer meets with their clients, or you don't even need a pronoun in the sentence. You could just say when a lawyer meets with clients. So just think about like how often you're gendering something that is not gendered. Like a hypothetical lawyer doesn't need a gender to be a lawyer. Like their gender is irrelevant to the conversation. You're just talking about what a lawyer would do. So why mention the gender of the lawyer at all? Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is another one we hear all the time. It's uncomfortable for non-binary people to constantly be referred to this way. Like, and I don't even think it's that a lot of us even mind that you say ladies and gentlemen, like we understand that it's a common way to greet crowds, but it's just like such a weird thing to constantly be grouped by your gender when you don't really have a gender, or like if you identify as agender or you feel like disconnected from binary gender, like so to have people constantly refer to you as a group as ladies and gentlemen is kind of a weird thing. And so and if you think about it, it's weird to look at a group of people and to call them out by a specific attribute that they have no control over. Like it's just who they are. And so I always suggest like referring to the crowd by who they are and not like their identity, but like what do they have in common? So saying like, welcome distinguished guests, welcome students, welcome faculty, staff, and students, welcome CCP Lions, like use things that everyone in that crowd has in common. Like if you're at a conference for nurses, welcome nurses. Like there's something that that crowd has in common that has nothing to do with their gender. There's no reason to bring up their gender, especially in fields that are often attributed to specific genders. So like I mentioned with lawyer, often using he, him pronouns. Often you'll hear nurses being referred to as women using she, her pronouns. How does that make male nurses feel? How does it make non-binary nurses feel? So there's just no reason to refer to people by gender. Like gender is a thing that exists, but like we gender so much in our society. And children prior to puberty are basically like identical, like biologically identical before they go through puberty. And so like we gender so much kid stuff as well, which is also a somewhat uncomfortable thing for non-binary and trans people. How can I help you, ma'am? When dealing with customer service, a lot of times we're trained to use sir or ma'am. Teaching people to gender folks based on their outward appearance is part of the issue when it comes to trans people being respected in customer service spaces. And so I suggest you just remove sir and ma'am from your vocabulary unless you're dealing with an older patient who specifically wants to be referred to that way. I think it just trains you to kind of use gendered language and to gender people by looking at them, which is something we're trying to avoid. And it's kind of antiquated. Like it's something that really only older people like demand or refer or like and want to happen. So like I haven't really met a lot of younger people who like love being referred to as sir or ma'am. Okay. So yeah, just say, how can I help you? You don't need it at all. We're almost done. There's only a few more slides here. So a student called and she wants to meet with you. A student called to request a meeting. That's a simple one. Like there's no reason to bring up the student's gender at all, especially if you don't know the person's gender and you're just guessing by the sound of their voice on the phone. All right, so let's talk a little bit about microaggressions. So microaggressions are things that are meant to be either complimentary or meant to be kind of matter of fact and not meant to be offensive, but are offensive. So one example I like to give a lot is when talking to a person of color, people who say, oh, you're so articulate. So when you say you're so articulate to a person of color, what you're really saying is, based on your skin tone, I didn't think you would be articulate because of stereotypes that I hold about people of color. And so therefore, I'm giving you this backhanded compliment, which sounds like a nice thing to say, but is really underlining my existing biases. And so when we talk about microaggressions, the person is not necessarily meaning to say something offensive or meaning to do something offensive, but they live in a biased society and they have these kind of held beliefs that are problematic, and those are coming forward. So, do you know Steve? He's also gay. This kind of plays into the idea that all people from a specific minority group know each other, which like there's some truth to because communities can be small, but just to think that people all know each other because they're part of the same minority group or marginalized group is a little bit problematic. And even worse, I should set you up with my friend Steve. This goes into the assumption that if you like that two gay people just automatically would click because they're gay, even if they have nothing in common. So it's always important to look at gay people, LGBT people as people. They're not just going to be like, just hit it off because they both are gay. You should make sure they have something in common. You don't seem gay or you don't look trans. These are things that are often said that seem like a compliment, but the reality is it's saying like, I expected you to be a certain way because of stereotypes, or I expected you to look a certain way or act a certain way and you don't. And so again, it's playing into those stereotypes. I'm fine with gay people, just don't rub it in my face. This is one I hear all the time. And it's really frustrating because I think a lot of straight people and cisgender people don't realize how often they rub their sexuality or gender in people's faces. I think if you've ever worked in an office, like how many people keep photos of their family on their desk, how many people talk about their families at work, how many people talk about like going on dates or going out with their family, having their kids, their wedding plans, all those things get discussed all the time. And when straight people discuss their social life and their home and family life outside of work, people don't bat an eyelash. But if a gay person did the exact same thing, they would be told, well, we don't want to hear that. That's inappropriate for the workplace. And that's a problem because like just sharing a part of who you are should not be considered political or controversial. You're not like other gay people. Again, this plays into stereotypes, but also exceptionalism. This allows people to maintain biases and strongly held beliefs against the LGBT community while having people who are friends within that community. So someone who thinks it's wrong to be gay but has a gay best friend, they use this kind of "you're not like other gay people" as a way to kind of compartmentalize and separate their personal feelings with their widely held beliefs. And so it's really important to kind of avoid this way of thinking, because it allows you to be like, well, I don't think that gay people should have the right to marry, but my best friend is gay and that's fine because he's different than everyone else. He's different than other gay people. He doesn't fit the stereotypes. He's not flamboyant. And that basically allows them to hold those kind of toxic views about LGBTQ people without confronting it, because they don't view their friend as an actual gay person, but rather than an exception to the rule. Ladies and gentlemen, and sir and ma'am, we've already kind of covered this one. OMG, let's be best friends. You can do my makeup. This like assumption that gay men specifically know how to do hair or makeup is a stereotype. You can't be a lesbian. You're so girly. You don't even like sports. This is another thing that plays into stereotypes, that not all people who are part of the LGBTQ community look the same, act the same, dress the same, or have the same exact way of like navigating the world. You're so brave is another one I really dislike. Like we're just trying to go to Starbucks and pick up a coffee. We don't want to be told how brave we are for presenting in a more flamboyant way, or like dressing in a more feminine way when you are perceived as male, or if you're just a trans person existing in the world. You don't necessarily want to hear "you're so brave" when you're just trying to like go throughout your day. And it's just a phase. This is really minimizing language. It makes it seem like that questioning your gender identity or your sexuality is not okay, or that that questioning phase is always temporary, or it just kind of minimizes a lot of what LGBT people go through. And love the sinner, hate the sin is another one that seems it seems supportive because you're saying love the person. But by calling them a sinner, you're also creating a value judgment. You're also putting your own religious beliefs upon someone else who may not share those religious beliefs. And it indicates that you believe that something that someone is, like an identity that they hold, it's part of who they are, is inherently evil or sinful, which is insulting no matter how you say it. What do you mean you're asexual? Everybody likes sex. This is another thing that kind of minimizes identities, makes broad sweeping statements. Like to say everybody likes sex is kind of an ignorant thing to say. Like just because you experience things one way doesn't mean everyone experiences that way. And there is 1% of the population who identifies as asexual, and clearly they exist. We're good as long as you don't flirt with me. This one is often said by people who are usually unattractive. I don't know what it is, but like the people who say this are the people who I never would have considered flirting with in the first place. It comes from a place of insecurity. It comes from a place of like kind of fear. It's not a great thing to say to someone. Bisexuality isn't real. You have to pick a team. That's another one that is heard from both straight people and gay people. And this is another thing where it's like, you don't like, sexuality is not a shared experience, and just because you experience it one way doesn't mean everyone else does. And just because you're only attracted to one gender doesn't mean that people who are attracted to more than one gender are wrong or have to pick a side. It just means that you need to open your mind to other people's experiences. She used to be a man. We talked about this a little bit earlier. When you're talking about a trans woman, she is a woman. that's her gender identity. And she didn't used to be a man. Society just called her a man and referred to her as a man, even though she has always been a woman. That's so gay when you mean something negative instead of like, that's I don't think that really needs much explanation. You're equating someone's identity with something bad. Lesbians are hot. This is another thing that is used for like, it's the fetishization of gay women. It's treating them like sex objects rather than people. Treating public displays of affection as sexual. We talked about this a little bit with the coworker example. I've seen straight couples like straight up making out in a public space and nobody says anything. And then in that same public space, a gay couple holding hands was told to be more discreet. So when you treat public displays of affection from gay couples as like sexual or inappropriate, when a straight couple doing the same thing would not be seen as such, that is discrimination. Treating LGBT topics as inappropriate for children. Similar thing here, like we talk about relationships with children all the time. There's things that are sexually inappropriate to talk about with children, but that's true of straight people and queer people. And so like saying that gay people exist and saying that trans people exist and talking to children about our like existence in life and like families that are not traditional families, like people who have two moms or two dads or a trans dad, like those things are things that children experience and go through. So how could they be inappropriate for children to talk about? Giving a thumbs up to same-sex couples when you see them walking down the street. That's the same thing to like, you're so brave. It outwardly seems like a thing of support, but it can be uncomfortable because like, if I'm walking down the street holding hands with my partner and someone just gives me a thumbs up, I'm going to think like, are we sticking out like a sore thumb? Like, am I in danger? Like, are we too visibly queer that I might get like attacked because people are like noticing us? Or like, why is that person going out of the way to give me a thumbs up when I don't know them? This is kind of a weird thing. Complimenting a person's clothing because it doesn't match their assigned gender. This happens a lot to trans people. So I'm a non-binary person. I wear dresses sometimes, and I've had times where I'm like wearing a very simple like sweater that just happens to come from the women's section, and I will get compliments on it all night. Like even when there's another person, a cisgender woman who's wearing the same thing as I am, I will get compliments. And it's like, are you complimenting me because you actually like the clothing I'm wearing, or are you complimenting me as a way to do that kind of like weird thumbs up or like you're so brave kind of moment where you're like going out of your way to be like, I'm okay with this, even though I didn't ask you if you were. And then kind of using LGBTQ jargon like Yas Queen from someone who's not part of the community. That's always an awkward kind of interaction, especially because that is kind of taken from not only the LGBT community, but also the Black queer community and Black women. And so to see people who are not part of any of those communities using those terms and often using them incorrectly is also uncomfortable. So we've gone over quite a bit of things like pronouns, microaggressions, gender, sexuality, biological sex. So let's talk about like what this means to you as someone who can be an ally to the community and as someone who will probably have to work with the community working in healthcare. Stand up for people when you see discrimination, including microaggressions. If you notice that an attending doctor is constantly misgendering a patient or using their wrong name, it's great if you can be the person to correct them, so the patient doesn't always have to be the one correcting themselves. If you have a coworker who identifies as part of the LGBT community and you see them being discriminated against, like it's great for them to have someone who can stand up for them and say something. It's exhausting to constantly stand up for yourself and constantly have to kind of go to bat for yourself and correct people who are using the wrong name or pronouns for you. So it's always great to have someone who's willing to help. Another thing is paying attention. Like if you know someone is trans and you see someone kind of using gendered language around them a lot and you notice them being uncomfortable, like just pay attention to their reaction to things. See if there's ways you can help, talk to that person and see how you can be a better ally. But it really requires you to kind of pay attention to things that may not impact you personally, but will impact people from marginalized groups around you. If you make a mistake, apologize. Like as a trans person, I've messed up people's pronouns and names. It happens. A lot of trans people understand that it happens, especially folks who've known us for a long time by a different name or pronouns. It takes time to learn and we get it. The important thing is that you apologize when you make mistakes, that you don't over apologize. Like if you accidentally said she instead of he, that mistake was like a second long, and then your apology is like 10 seconds long, and it just, you just made this into a long drawn out thing where you're now drawing attention to it. So don't make a big deal out of it. Don't make it into a big thing. Don't make excuses. Don't try to explain why you made the mistake. Don't try to like, well, I was thinking this, or it's confusing. We don't necessarily want to hear it. Just say, sorry, I meant he, and move on. Don't get defensive. Don't make it about you. Like literally just apologize. If you say she when you meant he, say, oops, I meant he, and move on. Just that's it. And the biggest thing is if you accidentally offended someone and you don't really understand why, it's not their job to educate you, especially when they're upset. So I would always suggest apologizing. And then if that person is still upset with you, try to talk to someone else. Email my office, like talk to someone who's part of the LGBT community and say, I said this and the person got really upset and I'm not sure what I did wrong. Ask them to explain it to you. And then if you're really close to that person and you really want to make things right, wait until it's cooled down a little bit and then ask if you can talk to them about it a little bit further. Always ask if they like are comfortable talking about it. And if they say no, move on. I would never just kind of like corner someone and start talking about things that may be upsetting. It's always great to say, hey, can I talk to you about this? I know that I messed up and I want to make it right, or I want to ask you a clarifying question. But I think oftentimes people have to not only educate and correct people, but also then educate them and sometimes argue with them just to be respected and treated the way they want to be treated. So make it easier on them and kind of do what you can as an ally so that they don't have to do as much work as someone from a marginalized group. And then with pay attention comes listen. I think one of the biggest things is that if you are an ally to a marginalized group that you are not a part of, you do not know what it's like to be a part of that marginalized group, and you don't know what it's like to experience discrimination as that group. So if someone says something's transphobic or that they felt disrespected, it's not your job to basically tell them that you feel that they're overreacting. You have never experienced transphobia. So how do you know they're overreacting? How do you, like, just because you as a cisgender person may think that they are overreacting as a trans person, like you don't live as a trans person, you don't experience transphobia the way that they do. They are an expert on their transphobia. They are an expert on what it's like to live as a trans person in this society. And so it's important that you listen to what they're saying and understand what they're saying and treat what they're saying as expert testimony rather than something that's up for debate. Whenever you're talking to someone from a marginalized group that you are not a part of, they are the expert on their marginalization and their oppression, and you should listen to them and understand what they're talking about because, again, they are the expert and you are trying to learn. And don't do it because you want a pat on the back. That is one of the most annoying things is allies who do it for like the kudos, for the pat on the back, for the cookie, for the recognition. Be an ally because it's the right thing to do, because you believe it's the right thing to do, because you want to stand up for a marginalized community. Don't do it because you want the recognition of being a good person. And then the most important thing, and this is our last slide, educate yourself. We live at a time where it's easier than ever to Google stuff. You have a computer in your pocket at all times. Like smartphones make it so that you have access to more information than any time in history. One thing to note is that we have always existed. Trans people have always existed. Intersex people have always existed. Queer people have always existed. It's just safer for us now to be out. The percentage of people who identify as LGBTQ has gone up in younger generations because it's safer for folks to come out, not because they're necessarily more queer. I think there's a lot of folks who are in older generations who would identify as queer if they were younger now, but have just been in the closet for all of their lives and won't ever come out. Or they are like folks who are bisexual, who mostly prefer the opposite gender.
opposite binary gender, so that they never really had to come out because they married someone and are in a straight relationship. That's the kind of stuff when we talk about where people have just kind of, we've always existed, but it hasn't always been safe for us to come out. So as our terminology is evolving and changing, sometimes the things that you learned in an LGBT seminar 10 years ago are now dated. So like the term intersex was created by intersex people, and the former term, which we don't use anymore, has fallen out of favor. But if you went to a training like 20 years ago, you may have heard that term thrown around often, and now it's considered offensive. So it's important to stay on top of these things and understand that our language is changing and evolving, because now that people are coming out of the closet and there's more of a community, we're able to create, we're able to talk about our own experiences and name our own identities instead of relying names that were kind of given to us. Not being educated on LGBTQ issues is willful ignorance. Like I said before, like you have more access than ever before. So if you come across a person in the LGBT community and they talk about an experience with oppression, and you're like, oh, I just don't know about that. Like, you can know about that. You can take the time to know about that, and continuing to just be like, well, that's just not my thing, is basically showing a willful ignorance where you just don't want to put the time into learning and attending a session like this, or using YouTube, or there's so many different resources out there that you could use to learn more. And like the excuse of like, I just don't know about that is not a great excuse. It just shows to the person in your life that you don't care enough about what they're going through to really put time into learning about it. You have greater access to information than any point in history. There is a point about fake news here. Like you always want to take sources that are created by LGBTQ people about their own experiences, because you can fall into a lot of conservative, anti-LGBTQ sources that kind of put out false information or information against our community that is not written by people in our community, and is kind of using thousands of years old text to kind of minimize our experiences and devalue our experiences. Like I said, there's literally a computer in your package, and it sends a message to queer people in your life that you don't care enough to learn. So take the time to learn, apologize when you make mistakes, be open to hearing difficult conversations about your own internalized biases, and really try to undo them. That's advice I give to anyone regarding any marginalized group. So whether that is learning about the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's learning about I don't know, another civil rights movement that we're talking about. Like, there's so many civil rights movements out there, and this kind of applies to being an ally to any marginalized group that you are not a part of. So whether that's the Black community, the trans community, the gay community, it doesn't matter. A lot of this stuff applies. So I'm gonna stop there and open it up to questions. I know you all are specifically working in healthcare, so I will open it up to any questions you specifically have about patient care or any of the terms we went over. Feel free to unmute your microphone or pop it into the chat. Okay, and I'm going to pop my email in the chat. So vscarfo@ccp.edu is my email address. If you have any questions that you did not get a chance to ask, or you are too shy to ask in front of everybody, or don't want to ask the entire group, feel free to send me an email. But thank you all. This is going to be recorded so that Laura can post it up in the virtual classroom for y'all. So I hope you enjoyed this session. I hope you got a lot of your questions answered, and I hope this was helpful to you as healthcare professionals. And I hope to see you all back on campus soon, hopefully, when this whole pandemic is over. So have a great rest of your day, and thank you for stopping in.